All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning PESACHIM Daf Tzadik Vav. We are just a few lines above the Mishnah. We're going to conclude the sugya that we finished on Daf Tzadik Hey by asking exactly where did we burn the emurim from the carbon Pesach that we offered in Mitzrayim. Nowhere in the Torah does it say that we built mizbachais or that we built bamas there in Egypt. Very interesting question. We're going to have a Gemara over here. We're going to quote a Targum Yonas and Ben Uziel. And we're going to basically learn two dinim today. Firstly will be the Mishnah. The Mishnah on Tzadik Vav Amud Aleph will ask, Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Doiris. Don't forget, we brought a carbon Pesach in Mitzrayim. We have a mitzvah in the Torah to always bring a carbon Pesach when we are halachically allowed to do so. And we're going to learn the dinim in which they share. And we're going to learn the dinim in which there's a difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doiris. We're going to have beautiful limudim, all based on psukim and Parshas Boy. As we will see, there is a pasuk that says Ve'avadato, and from that pasuk we compare the Pesach Mitzrayim to Pesach Doiris. You have other psukim that differentiates the dinim, and we're going to see exactly how we apply both the differences and their comparisons. And Daf Tzadik Vav Amud Beis, we're going to start with the Mishnah, which is really going to allow us to review dinim of Temura. The Mishnah today on Tzadik Vav Amud Beis really will continue into Tzadik Zayin, basically the entire daf, all the way until Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis. There is a din of Temura. Temura means that if I already have an animal that was mugdash with kedushas haguf, an animal was a oila, an animal was designated as a shlamim. So the Torah tells us that a person should not take a chulin animal and say that the kedusha of the oila should be substituted on the one that's chulin. However, if a person did make such a oral declaration, they both remain kodesh. And we're going to be dealing with what happens if you made a temura on a carbon Pesach. What will be the status of that carbon? Now, really, we're going to have two options. There is a general rule that we learned many times together, that moisar Pesach, a residual Pesach, or a carbon Pesach that's no longer on the 14th in the afternoon, by default becomes a carbon shlamim. Question will be, will the temura of a Pesach be itself offered as a carbon shlamim? Does it become a carbon shlamim? Or for some reason it's not fit for that animal itself to be offered on the altar? You would have to do something that's common that we find in Kachim, and that is yira ache yistov. Let the animal graze until it gets a blemish, which then will allow you to redeem the animal on money, and with the money you will buy a carbon shlamim. So we're going to have a Mishnah that's going to tell us that sometimes you can offer it itself as a shlamim. Sometimes you have to do the system of yira ache yistov. We'll try to figure out why sometimes yeah, why sometimes not. We're going to learn the difference between moisar Pesach and a Pesach dochui. And there is a rule that once an animal that was once fit to go on the altar was rejected, an animal that's rejected can no longer be brought on the altar, which will, so to say, force us to follow the path number 2, which is wait until it gets a blemish, sell it, and then with its money buy a new animal that's unblemished and offer it as a shlamim. We're going to have two versions of Rabbi regarding a certain prat, regarding a certain scenario. What happens if you have an animal that is rejected? Not a temura, an animal that became rejected, that animal, the source animal, cannot be offered itself on the mizbeach. And that animal now becomes the father of the temura. You make a substitution from an animal that has rejected sanctity. We'll get familiar with these terms. So do we say that the animal that is the substitute, that's the temura, from an animal that's dochui, automatically becomes dochui and needs to undergo blemishing, selling it, and then with its money buying a shlamim? Or do we say that if this temura animal was never rejected, even though it came from an animal that was rejected, this animal could be offered as a shlamim? That will be a question. There's going to be two versions in what Rabbi said. Hopefully in this daf, we'll get in version number 1, and on daf Tzadik Zayin, We'll repeat all these the pratim, and we'll continue with Rabbi version number 2 and a lot more. Chavre, we left off on the Tzadik Vav Amid Aleph, 9 lines from the top of the Amid towards the beginning of the line. Boi Rebbe Zera. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol na'im v'dvar. Boi Rebbe Zera. He asked the following inquiry: Emurei Pesach Mitzrayim Heicha Aktirinu. Where exactly did they burn the emurim? Emurim are those parts of the animal. Emurim from the word amar, that God said that these parts should be burnt on an altar, right? They are achilas mizbeach. You read the Chumash, you don't find anywhere that in Mitzrayim we built mizbachos or bamas. Now, it would have been allowed to do so, but don't forget also that a Pesach, like we mentioned, Bechlal is not brought on a bama. Even during the time of Heter bamas are good for communal korbanos, whether Pesach is included or not, is nishpashet. So Amar le Abaye, so Abaye tells Rab Zera, Uman leima lon deloy sheviske avud, who says that they didn't roast all of those parts and consumed it. In other words, indeed, by the fact that the Torah never spoke about us having to burn those parts of the carbon that later have to be burnt on the altar, is that ayah that at that time, yes, we needed to slaughter it. Yes, we needed to put the blood on the lintel and on the mezuzahs, so it says in the Chumash, but all of the rest of the animal, we were able to eat. Now, by the way, part of the murim is chelev. If we were keeping all of the dinim kashrus, whether even though it was optional, then those parts we wouldn't eat. But the point of Abaya is, he's saying that we did not burn any part of the Koren Pesach and any sort of mizbeach. And furthermore, va'oid, Hatane Rabbi Yosef, Gimel Mizbachais Hayusham. We do have amongst the works of the Tanoim as an expression that in Mitzrayim there were 3 mizbachais, and as will become clear, these are not your normal mizbeachs, which were Al Hamashkoif, the lintel, the Al Shtei HaMezuzos, which was where we needed to apply the blood. So fakert, it's not only the fact that God doesn't mention Mizbeach, the fact that there is a mention of what to do with the blood that we did not consume, and the Torah does not mention anything about the emurim, that makes it clear, according to our Gemara, that that there was nothing else there. The Torah writes exactly all of the procedure, and this, whatever is not mentioned, Taka did not need to happen. So holds our Gemara. Stam lahoir, that the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, that in itself is kind of, we remember we spoke about this, is there Targum Yonasan on the Chumash. We have it in our Mikrois Gedolos. The Gemara doesn't say that there's Targum on the Chumash, but be that as it may, when it says in Parshas Yisroi that Va'esa eschem al kanfei nisharim va'avi eschem eloi, right in the beginning of the Parsha of Matan Torah, that God says that I took you on the wings of eagles and brought you to me. This is not about the future of Mashiach. The Pshat in the Chumash is that Moshe Rabbeinu was telling the Yidden, this already happened. When did it happen? Look inside the Yonasan ben Uziel. It says clearly that when we were in Mitzrayim, the way of transportation, the way of movement that will happen after Mashiach will come. There are many Maimonic Hasidus that says that when it says in the Chumash that V'hayimid Shabbos b'Shabbatoi, that all of the Yidden are going to come and bow down to Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash, it means that no matter where a Jew will live after Mashiach's coming, there's going to be a new way of travel that will be very quick. Not like we have travel today. Even travel today is fantastic comparing it to 100 years ago. But we will be able, from wherever you live, to go right away to the Beis HaMikdash and to come back. So Mama, she writes, that is what happened in Mitzrayim, that Hashem took everyone, including Moshe Rabbeinu. It's an interesting Yonasan ben Uziel. You know, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to enter the Holy Land. Yeah, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to enter the Holy Land after the Torah was given in order to be able to keep almost all the mitzvahs that are contingent in being in the Holy Land. But he was there before. Hashem took us to Harabayis, to Yerushalayim. And according to him, L'chora, we built a Mizbeach and we offered the Korban Pesach, where Korbanos should be brought. Our Gemara, obviously, you know, our Gemara doesn't follow that shita. Our Gemara says it was brought in Mitzrayim, and Adarabah, there was no Mizbeach, and there were no Emurim. And now, beautiful, the way Ravina and Avashi were Masader, the Gemara, the next Mishnah really is like a flow from the Gemara. It says the Mishnah, Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Doiris. What are the differences between the Pesach that was brought in Egypt and all of the Pesachim that were brought after the Torah was given? So says the Mishnah, Pesach Mitzrayim, number 1, Mikchoy mi be'esod. we needed to designate it from the 10th day of the month. This is written clearly in the Chumash. Such a designation was never needed in the future. You don't have to take the animal and designate it from the 10th. Number two, the blood application on the mashkoif and on the two mezuzahs was not done the way it was done in the Beis Hamikdash, and we learned about it, that you received the blood in a mizrak, and then it was poured on the wall of the mizbeach, one application on an area that was above the yesod. There it was different. You didn't pour it on the mezuzah. You didn't pour it on the mashkoif. The Torah says, "V'ton hazoha ba'agudas ezoif." So you had a bundle of a certain grass called hisap, which is used for many other dinim in the Torah. You needed to dip the hisap, the ezoif, in the blood, and that is how you applied it. And not only one application, but va'ala mashkoif va'al shtei hamezuzos. And another unique din, the nechal b'chipazon b'layla echad. Now, lecha b'chipazon, let's put a comma. It was eaten in haste. What's eaten in haste? So it says in the Chumash, and by masnechem chagurim. In those days, people didn't have suits. They used to wear some sort of robe, a jalaba, and they had a belt. And whenever they were in their homes, they took the belt off. So you had many times you hear in English, they needed to gird their loins. Masmentas. There was a way that they used the belt and they tied that jalaba that it, so to say, it almost became like pants. They tied it up in a way in order to travel properly, in order for them to be perhaps better protected from the elements. But they needed to gird their loins before they sat down to eat, which is the opposite of the norm. Normally, when you sit down to eat, you untie your belt, or as it says again in the pasuk, na'alechem biraglechem. I know many people wear shoes in the home today. Many people take their shoes off. They used to take their shoes off because the streets, there was no asphalt, it was very dirty. But the Chumash says that they needed to eat Pesach Mitzrayim Pasha dressed and ready to immediately go out on a trip. That's something unique. Pesach doiris, you don't have to be dressed, they had with your luggage ready. Next din, which that next din has to be clarified, Belayla echad. Now this is a problem because Pesach doiris, we know, is also only Belayla echad. The Gemara will explain. Pesach doiris noy kol shiva. This final difference will have to be clarified, as we said in the Gemara. Okay. The Gemara's kasha. How do you know that Pesach Mitzrayim needed to be designated on the 10th day? Says the Gemara because it says in Parshas Boy, Dabro kol adas Yisrael leimoid be'eser lachodesh hazeh, clear on the 10th day. The yikhu, right? So says the Gemara that be'eser lachodesh hazeh and sadrush v'yikhu zeh. The word hazeh goes on the v'yikhu, which is not the pshat. That this one, mikchai be'eser, should be taken or designated from the 10th. So the word zeh excludes the ein pesach doiris mikchai be'eser. Hi, elamayatov, every time the Torah says zeh, does it mean to say only this one has the din? When it says, that you need to what? You need to guard it. And we know that l'mishmeres means that you have to examine that animal every day, all of the 4 days, leading up to the 14th of Nisan, to make sure that it remains unblemished. Are you going to tell me that this din of bikur, of 4 days examination, is only by Pesach Mitzrayim? Because it says hazeh, right? That was the limud. If the hazeh of a yikhu excludes Pesach doiris, so every other hazeh should exclude Pesach doiris. Hachinami zeh tom bikur gimel yamim kaidem shchita ve'ein achad tom bikur. First of all, zeh not only to exclude Pesach doiros, it should exclude all the other karbanos, which is not true. The Hatanya ben bagbag oimer ben bagbag, right? A very unusual name, really means ben gadim. Many say that ben bagbag and hey, that's in Pirkei Avos, refers to the same person. Hey is also a name associated with converts, because when Avraham Avinu converted, so to say, right before the Bris Milah, Hashem added the hey. So did Hashem add a hey to Sarah? Beis Gimel, first of all, is Rashi Tevis Ben Gadim, but Beis Gimel is 2 and 3 is 5. Anyways, Ben Bagbag says, Minayin Lu Tamid Shaton, Bikur Gimel Yamim. Guys, we have this in Erechim, we have this in Menachos. Every carbon Tamid needed to be not only designated, but you needed to examine it for 4 days. If you remember the whole challenge that every year you have to buy the new karbanos from the new money. And because of the Bikur Dalad Yomim, so you have a leftover animals, and you can't offer it on with the new shkalim, the whole system, the complex system of how they would deconsecrate it, which is not simple because the animal doesn't have a blemish, and then they would repurchase it. Same thing with the ketredas. That was that sugya. But that din is you did it for 4 days because Shenamer it says in Parshas Pinchas Tishmeru. Tishmeru means to guard it. That means to examine it from blemishes. And we learn from the Mishmeres Tishmeru. Fakert from Pesach Mitzrayim, we have a Gzeir Shava. So the kasha is, you are telling me that the hazeh of the vehikul is a exclusionary word. So why doesn't it also exclude all the other karbanos from the din of bikur? Answers the Gemara, Shani Hassan, because it's
Rabbi,
said.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
This is in Egypt that they're looking for blemishes and they're going to resell that. But in Egypt, weren't they gods to, who would they resell them to? Who would they resell the?
Very good. The answer is that they would buy it themselves. So when you have an animal that was designated to go on an altar, if the animal is unblemished, you cannot even sell it. But if the animal is blemished, which means this animal no longer is fit to go on the altar, so the level of sanctity goes down a little bit from, it's called Kedushas Haguf to Kedushas Damim. Now, when you sell it to yourself, that means that you designate money for it, its proper value, the holiness leaves the animal, it goes on the money. So for example, the blemished animal is good. You can do whatever you want with it, with some limitations. The money is holy. And then when you buy with that money a new unblemished animal, so the kedusha, the holiness goes into the unblemished animal.
Okay, so it doesn't have anything to do with the Egyptians.
No. Selling it means redeeming it. It means you redeem it on money. Very good. Okay, so back over here. So answers the Gemara again, Shani Hassan, because by Bikur it says Tishmeru. So you have Gzeir Shava. Pesach Doiros. Now hold on, Tishmeru should only link it to the Talmud. The truth is that Pesach Doiros also needs to have the Bikur Dalad Yomim. How do you know that? Why isn't it excluded from the Hazeh? Lachoidesh Hazeh, because it says, here we go. The Abadato Esho Avoida Hazois Bachoidesh Hazeh. From this pasuk, the code word that we will quote until the end of the Amid is just the word Ve'avadato, which is the first word in this verse. Ve'avadato as Avoidesh Hazeh Bachoidesh Hazeh teaches you shiur kol avodas chodesh zeh kizeh. It's extra here. The whole pasuk is you should do the avoid of this month. The whole thing is extra. It's to tell you that this verse is to compare the rules of Pesach Mitzrayim to Pesach Doiros. Okay. Now the problem is if the word hazeh does exclude, and by the din of mishmeres, by the din of Bikur Dalad Yomim, by Pesach Mitzrayim, it says Hazeh. If it's not excluding other karbanos, because Talmud is included, if it's not excluding Pesach Doiros, Elyahu Hazeh, what does it exclude? Lama'utei Pesach Sheni de Kavosei. Pesach Sheni, one would have thought, will be like Pesach Rishon. The Hazeh tells you that Pesach, the animal designated for Pesach Sheni, does not need to have this pre-examination for 4 days. That is, the Hazeh has to exclude. But the Avadita compares Pesach Doiros to Pesach Mitzrayim. Let's go back to it. It says regarding Pesach Mitzrayim, again, the word Hazeh, so Hachinami, that only Hazeh Nechel Balayla Echad, Naila Balayla, but the Einacha Nechel Balayla. In other words, maybe you learn from over here that every Pesach, other than the one brought in Egypt, needed to be eaten dafka a day. Because it says Balayla Hazeh. So the Gemara says, no, now that we have this Avadata, Omar Kra the Avadata Eso Avoida, which teaches us that all of the Pesachim are compared. The rules are the same. So now again, if Hazeh, all of that began because of how do we know that you have to pre-designate it only in Mitzrayim for 4 days? Because it says V'yikhu, right? It says Hazeh V'yikhu, so Hazeh does exclude. So Ella Hazeh, regarding eating the meat, Lamali answers the Gemara, you forgot the Gemara in Brachas, that either if you follow Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, learns from this Hazeh that Korban Pesach can only be eaten until midnight, and according to Rabbi Akiva, that holds that you can eat biblically the Korban Pesach until Alois HaShachar, we learned this. He learns from the Hazeh that Hashem wants to tell you that Pesach is not like a shlomim. A shlomim can be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. Pesach is not so. Oh, but it's not telling you the Hazeh only Pesach Mitzrayim and not Pesach Doiros. Now, Elama'ato weiter. When it says regarding Pesach Mitzrayim, V'chol orel lo yoichal boy, someone who's uncircumcised may not eat it. So the word boy and Hazeh are similar. It's an exclusionary word. The Torah could have written V'chol orel lo yoichal. Boy means it. It cannot be eaten. So hachinami the boy and oichel, but oichel the Pesach Doiros, and we know it's not true. An orel may not eat. Answers the Gemara again. Amar Kra, the words ve'avadata, that compares Pesach Doiros to Pesach Mitzrayim, but we have to exclude something from the boy. Ela boy lamali. So the answer is boy eno oichel. Abel hu oichel be'matzu marer. An orel cannot eat Pesach. And you might have thought that since the matzah and the marer biblically should be eaten together with the Pesach, so if the orel, the uncircumcised, is excluded from Pesach, he should be excluded from the mitzvah of matzah and from the mitzvah of marer, which is a biblical mitzvah when you have a Korban Pesach. So that's the boy. The orel only doesn't eat the Pesach, but the orel is mechuyev to eat both matzah and marer. When it says in Pesach Mitzrayim that the chol or kol ben nechor lo yoichal boy, ben nechor means a Jew who estranged himself from God by converting out, an apostate, that he also may not eat. So hachinami the boy and oichel, that this exclusion of a ben nechor is only in Pesach Mitzrayim, abel hu oichel a Pesach doiros, and we know it's not true because a ben nechor may never eat of any Pesach. So here again the Torah says va'avadata. So we compare Pesach Doiros to Pesach Mitzrayim. What do we exclude from the word boy? Ela boy lamali. So the answer is boy hamaras das poiselas. Yeah, if someone, God forbid, converted out, then he may not eat a Korban Pesach. The ein hamaras das poiselas betruma. But if you have a kohen that, God forbid, becomes an apostate, he will not be excluded from eating truma. He will be allowed to eat. So the boy is not excluding another Pesach, it's excluding a different din. And why did the Torah B'chlal have to exclude by the Pesach both an orel and an apostate? The itzrach lemichtav orel, the itzrach lemichtav ben nechor, because we would not on our own learn one from the other. The ichas v'rachmana orel, I would have said the reason why he may not eat a Pesach is mishum demois, because we consider a body that is not yet circumcised as repugnant. Abel ben nechor loy ma'is, it's his blemish is in his faith, but not in the physical. So you might have thought that he's not disqualified. So the Torah has to write that he is disqualified. We would say adarabba. It's a spiritual blemish. It's much worse. The ein liber l'shamayim, and he's not even, if he's an apostate, he's not having in mind Hashem. Abel odol the liber l'shamayim. So that's why the Torah has to exclude both. Let's go by to Elama'ata. No, very interestingly, we're going to have a couple of lines that Rashi writes here is not in the Gemara. Many times when there's a debate whether something is part of the text or not, there's a parenthesis. There is no parenthesis here. There's a reason for that. So we're going to read it. I'm going to touch the words and I'm going to just speak out to Rashi, pointing out that it doesn't make sense, but we'll read it anyways. Asks the Gemara, Elamata toishav v'sachir. Now it's good to know what these words mean. Here, when the Torah says toishav v'sachir lo yoichal boy, let me just tell you, toishav means a eved ivri who already served the 6 years, who was the one, since he was previously married, only in that circumstance was his master, so to say, allowed to give him a shifcha kananis to be with, and she, so to say, married her, and he has family with her. And when he is going to leave his servitude, he's going to have to leave that family. It says in the beginning of Mishpatim. So he says, "Hafti yasishti," that I love my wife, I love my kids, I don't mind being a slave. So the din is that a procedure is done to him, that he, so to say, his ear is pierced in a specific way, and he remains an eved for la'olam. La'olam doesn't mean forever. Forever, it means until yovel. That's a toishav. Sachir means an eved ivri during the first 6 years. Now, the truth is, says Rashi, that since a toishav and a sachir is an eved ivri, they participate in the eating of a Korban Pesach. And the Rashi quotes the Gemara in Adol is in Yavamis, that explains how do we interpret the words Toisha v'Sachar lo yochel bo. It's not to be taken literally, like many other verses in the Chumash. You need to have the oral Torah to know what you're reading. It seems like our Gemara is taking these words literally. That when it says Toisha v'Sachar lo yochel bo, if we were to take it literally, which is not the way it is, that a Toisha v'Sachar cannot eat in it. Again, in it means Pesach Mitzrayim. Hachinami the boy ain't oichel, but oichel hu bepesach doiris. And again, the emes is he ate in both. But let's read the words. So Amar Kra ve'avadeta, to compare them. Why does the Torah write the words lo yoichal boy? Lo yoichal would have been enough. Boy is an exclusionary word. Elo boy lamali, to tell you hamaras das poiseles by the Koren Pesach, and hamaras das. Who's speaking about hamaras das? We're speaking about a toshav and a sachet, like a mamish doesn't flow. In hamaras das poiseles betruma. And Rashi takes out the whole Gemara from Elama'ata until he says it was a corrupted text. It was like a copy and paste from words before, but it's pashut, it was never put in there. But it is here, so we read it. Elama'ata, when it says in Pesach Mitzrayim, Umalta oisai, first circumcise the person, the offerer, and then oz yoichal boy, and only then may he eat it. Hachinami the boy eno oichal abel oichal Pesach doiris. So Amar Kra ve'avadeta. Boy lomali. So the answer is boy milas zecharav avodav ma'keves. That if a person is circumcised, but he has a child that's 8 days old or older, and during the times that people had avodim, the person owned an eved that was not circumcised, that also disallowed the owner to partake in the Koren Pesach, even though he personally had a bris milah. So that then is unique to Pesach. Both Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doiris, we are comparing them from the Avadata. However, the Ein Milas Zechara Avadav Makeves Betruma. In other words, this is good to remember. If a Kohen is not circumcised, they may not eat Truma. But if the Kohen has a Bris Milah, but his son is not circumcised, then the Kohen could eat Truma. In other words, the standard of Truma is lower than Pesach. But if he's an apostate, he can eat it. If he has children,
if you have a newborn baby that's less than 8 days, it doesn't have. That's not
called an adol yet. We're not speaking about the physical foreskin. We're speaking about someone who halachically is called an adol. That only begins from the 8th day. That's important. Okay. Elama'ato, the final when it says in Pesach Mitzrayim, the etzem lo yishberu boy again in it. So hachinami the boy in a shover abel shover Pesach doiris. Answers the Gemara again. We use the pasuk va'avadata to compare all of the psachim one to the other. Why does God write the word boy regarding breaking of the bone? So we had this before in Daf Pei Gimel. Boy, because the prohibition of breaking a bone is only if the carbon is kosher. But if the carbon is invalid, then there is no lav in breaking of the bone. When it says al toichlu mimenu, no, now again mimenu. It's like boy, it's like hazeh. Don't eat from it, partially roasted. So do we say mimenu iyato oichel, abel oichel? No, the Pesach doiris. But when it comes to the subsequent, all the other psachim, it doesn't bother us if it's only partially roasted. No, Amar Kra ve'avadata, to teach you that the same prohibition is on all the psachim. Ela mimenu al toichlu mimenu. This word is extra. Lamali answers the Gemara. Right, we had this above. Like Rabba Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, to remember. So it says Rashi, I'm sorry, this is not above. This is taken from Peter Ka'adol. That means from Mesechtes Yevamis, where it says, look inside the last Rashi in the Amid, that you have the word mimenu by Pesach, which is taka extra. And you have the word mimenu by Meiser, meaning Meiser Sheni, and that's to teach you, Malahalun Adol Aser Pesach. And Adol may not eat Meiser Sheni. And the source is this mimenu. And more than that, with all of the pratim that many times most shitas hold, that if you have a gzeira shava, if it's not mufna, you can make a gzeira shava, but you can refute it. Here, dafka, this mimenu is take mufna, it's freed. It's only written for the gzeira shava. So even though there are many reasons why logically we should not compare the Meiser Sheni to Pesach, nonetheless we compare it. Okay, Nakud. So we successfully showed how from the words ve'avadata, we almost always compare the two psachim together. And yes, the word hazeh is an exclusion. And other expressions, like we said, mimenu is an exclusion, boy, an exclusion, but we explained what exactly are we excluding, right? Second to last line in the Amid, quoting the Mishnah. Now, this final differentiation the Mishnah pointed out between Pesach Mitzrayim, that Pesach Mitzrayim is Balayla Echad, and Pesach Doiris is Noye Kol Shiva, that has to be clarified, because the mitzvah of Pesach is only the first night. What do you mean for 7 days? What exact observance is the Mishnah referring to? Ilema a Pesach, that can be, because Pesach, Kol Shiva, Mi'ika, right? In the Lodoiris, do we eat the cardinal? No, we don't. It's only eaten on the first night of Tzadik Vav Amid Beis. Ella clarifies that the ending, the last line of the Mishnah, is only referring to Chametz. Now it's clear, we quoted the Chitas two days ago. It was when the Mishnah said regarding Chametz doesn't mean here Bal Yiro, Bal Yamatz, just to make that clear. Chametz means Pashat eating it. And look inside the Rashi. The Isur Chimutzai Noye Kol Shiva. Problem will be, if that is the Kol Shiva and Chametz, so when the Mishnah contrasts and it says Pesach Mitzrayim was only Balayla Echad, what does that mean? Does that mean that in Pesach Mitzrayim the prohibition of eating Chametz is only in one night? That's not true. That's a problem. I know that in Pesach Mitzrayim the Isur of Chametz, of not eating Chametz, was not for the whole week, but it was beyond one night. It was for the first complete day. It was from the night of the 15th until the 16th. If the contrast is regarding Chametz, the top line, Machlal, are you telling me the Pesach Mitzrayim Laila Echad v'Suloitz Nishtemes v'Hatanya Rabbi Yosef Glili Yomer Minayin lePesach Mitzrayim she'ein chimutz enoig elo yom echad. The Isur was only for one day. And Talmud Loimer, when it says right in Pesach Mitzrayim lo yei ochel Chametz, it's amazing how we adore Shem Smuchim. And it says right afterwards Hayoim atem yoitzim. Again, guys, it's, when you learn Chumash, you appreciate this. The Pshat, nothing to do one with the other. Today you're leaving. The fact that it says in the Chumash, today you are leaving, right after it says don't eat Chametz, that's merames, that the Isur of eating Chametz is on Hayoim. Hayoim means a 24-hour day. So what does the Mishnah mean? Elo hachika amar laila echad v'hu adin lo Pesach doiros. First of all, Pesach is eaten on one night, the only night. And Fakir, the Mishnah meant to say, and so is Pesach Doiris, also eaten only on one night. And now you have to add, but the Isur of eating Chametz, Pesach Mitzrayim was only for one day, more than one night. It's a night, it says the Laila and the Yom, a full 24-hour day. Pesach Doiris, Noye Kol Shiva. And just lahoyd, before we begin this new amazing sugya, as the Alter Rebbe points out, that there was a gilui of godliness at midnight, and one of the effects that such a revelation of God has on the physical world is that dough cannot become chametz, because chametz is yeshus. And yeah, we have the ability of being, so to say, arrogant when God is not revealed. When God is revealed, we naturally feel so humbled. That feeling of bittul carries over even to the physical world. So the fact was that when we left Egypt, we did not have chametz even afterwards. We did not have chametz. It's not pshat that it didn't rise because we were moving, which is the pshat. We had it on our backs and we were moving, and we learned already that when dough was moving, it doesn't become chametz. It was much more than that. When we left Egypt, we took our dough with us. That dough was unable to become chametz. But the isur of eating chametz was only for one day. Nekuda. Okay, Chavra, here we start. What's very important is that the principles that we're laying out right now will be necessary because it's one sugya from here until Tzadik Zayin Omid Beis. So let's go through a couple of rules. In Parshas B'chukoisai, there is a general rule written regarding all of the sacrifices. When you have a korban, an animal that already is imbued with kedushas haguf, it is going to go on the altar. Because its owner said, this is an oila, this is a shlamim, this is whatever it is. There is a certain verbal power, we have a big koyach in our speech, that if a person were to take another animal that's not kodesh, that's chulin, and they say that the holiness of this one, and whether they have to point, whether it has to be present, this oila, the kedusha, should be substituted on the new one that I just designated. You want to transfer the holiness. You want to remove it from animal A, it should go into animal B. So first of all, as a general rule, once an animal is imbued with Kedushas Haguf, you cannot remove its sanctity, right? But if we just spoke about that, it has to first get a blemish. If it has no blemish, you can't remove it. So you would think such a declaration is nonsense. It doesn't work. The Torah writes, interestingly, 2 statements. Don't make such a declaration. And if you did make such a declaration, it was partially effective. Partially effective means that you were unable to remove the sanctity of the original animal. The first one remains an oila, but the new one also, yes, becomes holy on the same level. So now you're going to have 2 karbanos oila, or you're going to have 2 karbanos shlamim. Now, what happens if a person makes a tumura from a karban pesach? We're going to learn dinam over here. Again, it's amazing that there's a whole mesechtas tumura. The whole statement is based on a violation. Sometimes we say that if you go against the word of God, it has no effect, but the Torah writes it has an effect. The Torah says, don't do it, but if you did it, okay. Now, what's the din of a tmuras Pesach? So before we speak about a tmuras Pesach, let's review one more rule, and that is that whenever you have a residual Pesach, a moisar Pesach, why would a person have a residual Pesach? For many reasons. But many people, when they designated animals from the outset, they designated 2. They designated one for achrayas as a insurance policy. They knew that they might lose their animal. So if they lose animal A, they'll already have animal B. Or it can be that they designated one karban pesach, they lost it, animal A was lost. So they bought another animal, they consecrated the new animal, and at some point, we'll see when, that's very important, they found the original animal. That's called Moisar Pesach. The rule is, Moisar Pesach is brought as a shlamim. Okay, and one final rule, which is very important. If an animal was mamish fit to go on the Mizbeach, and then it became rejected, that's the key word here. In here, it's called dachui or dichui. It was rejected. We'll see why would an animal become rejected. Once an animal becomes rejected, now really this is a machlokes tanoim, whether a living animal could become halachically rejected. We are going based on those who hold that it could. If an animal becomes rejected, then you cannot re-bring it on the altar. Then what would you have to do? You would have to redeem it, but before you redeem it, it has to become blemished. So then you would apply the rule of yire ache yistoef or tire ache yistoef, male, female, Zajac nekeva. You let it graze. You're not allowed to blemish it yourself, be a daim, but you put it in settings where the likelihood of it getting blemished is heightened, so it happens quicker, sooner than later. Once it's blemished, it doesn't have kedushas haguf. Now you sell it, and the proceeds, the money, is used to buy an animal to be offered as this one should have been. So if you have a moisar pesach, which by default becomes a shlamim, if for whatever reason it cannot be brought for a shlamim, so then you let it blemish, and with its money you buy a shlamim. Okay, now let's read the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Shamati. I remember something that I was taught when I was younger. I heard that Tmuras Pesach, the Tmura of Pesach itself, Kireva, is offered, obviously as a shlamim. However, I also heard that Tmuras Pesach ain't a Kireva, that a Tmura of Pesach, a substitution of Pesach, cannot be offered. And you know what? I forgot when yes and when not. That's what he said. So to which Omar Rabbi Akiva, I'll explain it to you, Ani Afarish. Now what's amazing is that before Rabbi Akiva speaks about Tamura, he speaks about another scenario. And that is, HaPesach shenimtza koidem shchitas HaPesach. A person we're gonna call animal Aleph and animal Beis. You designated what turned out to be only Aleph. We designated an animal and we lost the animal. We lost the animal after it was designated as a Pesach. So what did we do? We have to bring the Pesach. We bought another animal. We designated animal Beis. And then we find animal Aleph. So says Rabbi Akiva, if you found animal Aleph, the lost animal, the original animal, before you slaughtered the Pesach, listen to the words, before you slaughtered the Pesach, which means that when you slaughtered the Pesach, you actually had two animals that were equally available, and you needed to choose one over the other. When you choose one over the other, that's every choice. A choice means two steps. You are choosing A, but you're rejecting everything else. So if you had two animals in front of you and you bypassed, now it doesn't matter which one was bypassed, but just to be consistent, we will always speak about the scenario that you bypassed, you rejected animal aleph for whatever reason. The original animal you let go, and you chose animal base. So in such a case, since animal aleph that was fit, it was available, and you rejected it, you're choosing animal base is the rejection of animal aleph. Subscribing, once we accept that even a living animal can be rejected, an animal that was rejected can never be brought on the altar, even though you rejected it from a Pesach and you want to bring it as a shlamim. I know that. That's a classical moisar Pesach. You have another animal, you have a residual animal. But since this was rejected, this animal has to be used for a shlamim, but it itself may not be brought as a shlamim. And what is the rule? Yira ache yistoif. The word yistoif literally means until it becomes repugnant, which means until it becomes repugnant in the eyes of God Almighty, because it gets a blemish. So you allow it to graze. You can't blemish it, be a dayim, but you await for it to happen. You put it in settings where it's going to happen. And now the yimacher, sell it, the yavi b'dama of a carbon shlamim. So that's rule number one. Look, when people say, moisar Pesach is shlamim. No, not so quick. There are times that moisar Pesach cannot be used itself for a shlamim. When? When it was available, the words of the Mishnah, by the shechita. So you rejected one. You rejected it. It's no longer fit. Now, step number two, v'chein t'murasai. If a person now used Pesach Aleph that was rejected, and now they make a t'mura out of it, so the t'mura cannot be better than the source. Since the source animal itself is not brought on the Mizbeach, Yira Ache Yistof, that is where Rabbi Yeshua heard that t'muras Pesach eina kereva, because it's coming from a moisar Pesach that eina kereva. On the other hand, if animal aleph was lost, so we designated the animal base, but we only found animal aleph achar shchitas haPesach. Makes a lot of sense. Now, when we chose to bring animal base, we didn't reject any animal because it wasn't present. It was not available to be brought, which means it was also not rejected. So since in this scenario, the moisar Pesach, in the case of Pesach Sha'avda, was not rejected, so the animal aleph that we find later, that animal itself is karev shlamim. And now coming back to T'mura, if someone used that animal as the source of a substitution, and they shouldn't have done it, but they did it, so now the T'mura itself will be brought as a shlamim. Beautiful. There's one problem. What Rabbi Yeshua forgot, so to say, was the din of when do you bring the moisar Pesach and when do you not bring the moisar Pesach. The T'mura is just the outcome of it. So really, why did Rabbi Yeshua have to say, I heard that sometimes T'mura is brought, T'muras Pesach, sometimes it's not brought? The same question could have been asked that sometimes the moisar Pesach is brought, sometimes the moisar Pesach is not brought. Because that's really the source law. The T'mura is just the natural outcome. If you make a T'mura from a moisar Pesach that's brought, that T'mura is brought as well. If you make a T'mura from a moisar Pesach that's not brought, then the T'mura is not brought. So the Gemara asks, so why are you talking about T'muras Pesach? Why didn't you go to the source? The Lema, why didn't Rabbi Yeshua begin by saying that sometimes Pesach is Karef? We're speaking about moisar Pesach. Sometimes Pesach is not Karef. And automatically, I would know that if you make a T'mura from an animal that's brought, then the T'mura is brought as a shlamim. T'mura is never brought as a Pesach. But if you make a T'muras from a Pesach, from an animal that in itself is not brought, but Yira Ache Yistoif, so then it makes sense that the T'mura should be like it. So answers the Gemara Hakamash Malon. What we do want to point out is
Rabbi.
well, let me just finish 1 second. The Ika Tmuras HaPesach Deloy Karvom. In other words, don't forget that a Tmura can never be brought as a Pesach. It's very important. A Tmura, if you forget about losing, if you have an animal of Pesach and you make it into the source of a Tmura, just to know the din, the Tmura, the Torah says, V'hayohu usmarasa yeh kodesh. Kodesh it is. But from its very inception, it's brought as a shlamim. So one would think an animal that could have been a Pesach and it became rejected, it makes sense to say, since it was fit and rejected, so now you can't even bring it itself. You have to wait until it gets blemished. One would have thought that a Tmura should always be brought as a shlamim because it was never rejected, because a Tmura can never be a Pesach. So, yeah, the Mishnah wants to tell you the greater novelty that even a Tmura, if it's coming mikoyach, if it's coming from an animal that's rejected, so then it also is rejected. Meaning not that nothing happens to it, but it cannot be, so to say, better than its source. The source has to be first blemished, sold, purchased, shlamim. Same thing will be with the Tmura. Yes, Danny?
Just to clarify, anytime you lose your Pesach and you replace it and you find the original one, you have to stick with the second one.
No, you don't. No, you don't. You get to choose. I'll tell you more, because if you would have to stick with the second one, then you can't call the first one rejected. Rejected, the concept of rejection means is that you had two options and you chose one, which means you rejected the other. Now, guys, we're learning a machlekes. This is very important. The machlekes that we're learning is introduced as a machlekes amoyim. Really, it's a machlekes tanoim. You have to keep this. Just to know for the web audience, we're learning this Sunday morning. We have the schus of learning 2 daf, so it's easy for us when we're going to learn the next daf to remember this. But you have to remember what we're learning now. To mamish chap daf tzadik zayin is beautiful, but it's based. This is the foundation. If you don't have the foundation, there's no house. Itmar, Rabbi Amar, that when the Mishnah was speaking about, let's forget it, before the Tmura, you lost the animal and you found it. When did you find it? It has everything to do not with the time, not with 14th afternoon. It has to do is, did you find animal B after you offered animal A, right? Which means it was not rejected, because when you shechted animal B, you didn't even have animal Aleph, versus did you find it before shchita? However, Rab Zera understood the Mishnah Rabbi Akiva. No, it's not about when you found it, shchita, not shchita. The cutoff point is midday. Very important. In other words, according to Rab Zera, listen, Chevra, we designated animal Aleph. We lost it. We designated animal base. It's now 2 p.m. Erev Pesach. We did not bring ours yet. Now we found animal Aleph. You know what Rab Zera says? That when we bring animal bays, animal Aleph is not called a rejected animal. It's not called a rejected animal. Animal bays, we will bring as a shlamim, not sell it, not blemish it. Why? Because when midday came and we were mechuyev to bring a Pesach, it doesn't matter whether we brought it at that second or not. At that time, we only had one animal available. So when Chatzos came, it's almost like the time said, this is the animal, this is our group's animal. The other animal was not bypassed. That's the word. We never buy. The time it wasn't available. So even though de facto we found it before we brought our animal, it's not called bypassed. It's not called dichui. If it was never rejected, then we can bring it. Now, does it fit in the words of the Mishnah? Not so simple, right? The Mishnah says the word shchita. According to Rav Zera, that the time that we're looking for is the cutoff is not the actual shchita, but the time. Look inside the Mishnah. Haketani koydem shchitas haPesach. And indeed, sometimes we do that. Rabbi had other reasons why he wrote it that way, but what Rabbi meant was koydem zman shchitas haPesach. So we have a machlokes Rabbi and Rab Zera. And guys, we're going to quote Rabbi and Rab Zera. to explain many other statements we're going to learn tomorrow about Shmuel and about Rabbi Yochanan. It's going to, do you subscribe to Shitas Rabbah? Do you subscribe to Shitas Rab Zera? Is the animal called rejected if it was available before you shechted it? Or is the animal called rejected if it was available before midday? Once midday came and it was lost during the entry of the afternoon, then it's not available. So it's not bypassed. Says the Gemara, I want you to know that this machlekes Rabbi and Abzeda this is the way it is. It's taka machlekes tanoim. They did not begin with this. They just gave words to an older argument. What's the machlekes tanoim? According to Braisa, ha-pesach shenimsa koydem shchita. Afternoon, it's after chatzos, but before shchita. So the Tanakama says, Yira, that animal itself can never be brought as a shlamim. You know why? Because you had it by shchita. You were allowed to choose. So choosing one means you bypass the other. That means you rejected the other. Okay? Once you reject an animal, that's the klal. It's a shlamim, but not itself. Only if you find animal aleph after shchita, which means that you never rejected it. So now that you find it, that animal itself is yikrav. So Tanakama holds it's about shchita, mamish like Rabbi. Rabbi is continuing the sheet of the Tanakama. Now, Rab Zera is following the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, it's not about shchita, it's about the zman of chatzos. Koydem chatzos, yira. Because since it was available before midday, that's takab pshat. You could have you had an option. And choosing one means you bypass the other. You're doicha the other, you reject the other. But once you find it, la'achar chatzos, since when midday came, you only had animal days, animal aleph was never rejected. Never rejected, then therefore it itself will be brought as a shlamim. Okay, says the Gemara, Chavra Tudats, another gewaldige machlokes. Now, throughout, just to say, we're going to follow the Bach. I know the Gemara says Rava and Rava and Rava. We're going to follow his girsa that all of this is a statement of Rabba. Achar shchitas ha-pesach yavi shlamim. V'chulei.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
According to the opinion of Reb Zera, if you actually find that animal after chatzos, can you still choose it? Or is it like, no, it's already zman shchita, so we can't go back?
I don't know. I don't know for sure. It could be that you could choose, and still it's not called bypassed. We have to see what the Rishonim write. And maybe not. Maybe Taka, Danny, maybe that's really underlying the machlokes of Rabbi and Abzeda. I have to see what the Rishonim say over here. Could be Abzeda says you may not bring it. Makes sense. If you may not bring it, so you did not bypass it. Okay. Says the Gemara. Omar Rabbi, guys, really, there are two opposite versions of Rabba. This is such a gewaldige nuance. And for us, we're going to learn, it's also late, we're going to learn option A, the first version of Rabba in this daf, and then we're going to leave the second version for the next daf. Omar Rabba, lo yishanu elo shenimtza achar shchita. Now, guys, first of all, Rabba l'shitase. So this we have to shelve the machlokes Rabba and Abzeda, but Rabba cannot contradict himself. So Rabba says like this: that if you find Pesach Aleph after you shechted, and what's the din now? Now, animal Aleph is not called dichui. And this is the key. And vehemer boy achar shchita. Because now we're focusing on the ratio of the Mishnah. We're learning about Tumura, which means neither the original was rejected, and therefore the Tumura is not coming mikoyach, an animal rejected. That is weird. The Mishnah says that what? That the original animal is brought as a shlamim, and the Tumura is brought as a shlamim. Now listen to this case. What happens? Listen, you find animal aleph, Rabba l'shitase. The key is the shchita, koydem shchita. By the way, which means that this animal is rejected. Because when you chose to bring animal bays, we rejected animal aleph. But we didn't do the Tumura before the shchita. See, the Mishnah never spoke about that detail. We found animal aleph before shchita. But the Tumura was done after shchita. Oh, this is gewaldik. The Tumura was done at a time that animal A could not have been brought. You already brought animal aleph. We brought animal base, just to be consistent. It could go either. We already brought animal base. Animal aleph now it cannot be, says Rabba, Nevertheless, since the Tmura is coming mikoyach kedusha dechuya ka'asa, I don't care that right now there is no more Pesach for our group. We brought it. If the Tmura is coming from a source animal that became dachui, because that animal was found koydem shchita and we bypassed it, so this Tmura loy kereva, the Tmura was never rejected. The Tmura was never rejected. That's this version of Rabbi, that anything that comes mikoyach kedusha dechuya cannot be better than the kedusha dechuya. Again, against his teacher, against Rabbi, it says in a Braisa. Now, this Braisa is referring to the beginning of the Parsha of Shlamim. And the Torah begins the Parsha, Ve'im min hatsoin karbonai. Now, guys, remember that soin, flax, if it helps you. Soin is either sheep or goats. Now, the Torah speaks about the dinim, Ve'im min hatsoin karbonai, im kesev hu makriv, and we speak about the rules of a kesev, of a lamb, and then the parsha continues ve'im min hatsoin. Now the kasha is that if the Torah would not have written im kesev, the Torah just would have says im min hatsoin, and then a couple of verses later the pasuk would continue ve'im min ha'ez. Well, if the latter part is about the goats, then the first part has to be about lambs, because tsoin is either or. So really the words im kesev is mamish extra. We would have known that God is speaking about a lamb, again, from extrapolating by the fact that God later speaks about the goat. And you begin with the word soin, which is either one or the other. So Matam Alemed im Kesev answers the Braisa L'Rabbis, Tmuras Pesach, Achar Pesach, that if you have a substitution that was made later, that animal is brought as a shlamim, end of Braisa. Now really the Braisa goes on, but we don't need it for this kasha. For this version, that's enough to end of quote here. Asks the Gemara, what exactly is the Braisa speaking about? I mean, we just learned the Mishnah. Not every Tmuras Pesach is itself brought. Hechinami, ilema, that you found Pesach Aleph after Shchita, and therefore, obviously, the Hamer boy, you made this substitution that you should not have done, but you did it after Shchita. So why would we need to have a pasuk that the Tmura is brought as a shlamim? Pshita lama likra. We already know from other psukim that a residual Pesach is brought as a shlamim. So therefore, for there to be a chiddush elolav, the last narrow line must be that you found it before shchita. Now, guys, don't forget, there is a point, the Mishnah says, that if the animal was rejected, you can't bring it as a shlamim. So to make the Braisa, taka chiddush, it should be the case that Rabbi was speaking about. You found animal aleph before shchita. Now, if you would have made Tumura before the shchita, the Mishnah says, then you can't bring it as a shlamim. The Braisa therefore must be saying that the Hemer boy achar shchita. Fakir, that's the whole chiddush from the words im kesev, that since this Tumura, this substitution was never rejected, even though it comes from an animal that was rejected, this animal could be brought. Oh, against this version of Rabbah, answers the Gemara, no. La'olam, I'll tell you that the Braisa and explaining the verse is la'olam shenimsa achashchita, the classical case of Tamura. So Pesach Aleph was never rejected, and you made the Tamura after Shchita. And Enochanami, I don't need to have a pasuk. Sometimes a Tanach quotes a verse just to help you to lean on something, like to remember. It's only an asmachta, but hold on. Like we spoke out to Rashi, the words im kesev is taka extra. Had the Torah not written these words, we would have known that the first verses in Vayikra is speaking about a lamb, because the Torah in a few verses later says min ha'eis. Elo kralamai asa. Says the Gemara, there's another din that we taka learn from the words im kesev, that kesev l'rabois es a pesach la'aliyah, which is amazing. And Rashi tells us that when it comes to the other karbanos, those who are allowed to be brought from a lamb in each animal type, the Torah writes explicitly that the aliyah, that the tail of the lamb is offered on the altar together with the chaylev. However, if you remember also, we learned this not that long ago, that when it comes to the emurim of Pesach, the Torah doesn't write anything about it. All of it is learned, guys, from the Bechor. And by a Bechor, the Torah doesn't mention anything about an Aliyah, because a Bechor also comes from an ace. The Bechor also comes from cattle, and there you don't offer the tail. So how do you know by a pchal? How do you know that the tail of the Korban Pesach's lamb is burnt on the altar? So when it says im, from the im, you learn im kesav l'rabois Pesach she'avra she'nasoi. Oh, we're gonna have a lot about this in the next daf. So number one, what happens? A Pesach has to be within its first year. You designated the Pesach, and now it's no longer within its first year, so it becomes a shlamim or ushlamim haboy machmas Pesach. How do you have a shlamim machmas Pesach? Two ways. Either you made a temura, like we mentioned. Every temura by default is offered as a shlamim. You would never have a temura that can be offered as, it's not even an option. Or if you have it, like we're learning, you lost an animal, you found it at a certain point, all right? If you find it after shechita, then you bring it as a shlamim. Look, that it is just like a shlamim. Just like a shlamim, l'chol mitzvah shlamim. Just like shlamim needs smicha, so does this animal. Just like shlamim has to come with nesachim, so does this animal. Just like by shlamim, you have to first wave the chazay and the shoik, and then give it to the kohen. So by this shlamim. However, it's a new din. What din is the ace different? For this din, for the tail, is limeid al ha'ei she'eina tu'una aliyah. Bottom line is that we are leaving today's daf by having the version of Rabbi that holds, which is his chiddush, that when, even if you make a temura after its source is rejected, whenever you make a temura after the source was rejected, even if you made it at a time that was after shechita, I don't care. Anything that comes mikoyach rejected is itself rejected, and that animal also has to be sold, and only its proceeds are used to buy a korban shlamim. A lot more to be continued.
So what does he do in that case?
What do you mean? What does he do in that case?
If both animals he can't bring, what does he do for? So then what animal does he bring as a korban pesach?
No. The case is always that we designated animal base and we blood base. We're speaking about people that did the mitzvah. We lost animal olive.
If the animal olive was rejected, we're saying that animal base can either because it can't be greater than animal.
No, Rabbi. There's like this. There's two psachims that when I say aleph and beis, I'm only referring to the Pesach. And then there's another din of a temura. We're going to call the temura. We're going to use the word temura, not to get confused. So like this, we designated animal aleph. We lost it. We designated animal beis for Pesach, not temura. We didn't make a temura. We bought another animal. Then at some point, even though we found animal aleph, we found animal aleph. We found it before chatzos. That's l'kol ha'alma. Now we have to pick one or the other. So picking one rejects the other. That other can never be brought as a shlamim. If that other was used for a temura, according to Rabbi, now even if we made the temura after shechita, I don't care. The temura cannot be better than the source. So animal aleph and the temura yirat she'istov. Okay.
And when could that temura be actually brought as a shlamim?
Anytime after the 14th in the afternoon. Don't forget, the 14th in the afternoon, aside of exceptions, we cannot bring any carbon because the Talmud was brought already. Aliyah hashleim. It's not even an issue. In other words, whatever happened, the one that will be either itself a shlamim or yirat she'istov, even if it is itself a shlamim, it's never brought then. Pesach, only Pesach is brought until the 14th in the afternoon. Okay. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Tzadik Zayin. We are mamish heading towards the end of the 9th chapter. Just a heads up, we have very few dafim left of Kachim, but this is going to be a real Kachim daf. First, we're going to continue to learn the din that we began in the Mishnah Tzadik Vav Amud Beis about Rabbi Yeshua says that I heard that I forgot that sometimes a temura of a Pesach is itself brought as a shlamim. Sometimes the temura of a Pesach may not be brought as a shlamim. And how Rabbi Kiva explained that statements that Rabbi Yeshua remembered that the temura question is really contingent on a prior question, and that is that if when you designate an animal Pesach and you lose it, animal aleph was lost, so you designated Pesach base, another animal, and you find animal aleph. when you find animal Aleph, and you have two animals in front of you, when you are allowed to choose one or the other, and you choose one, which means you reject the other, a rejected Pesach may never be brought as a shlamim. And if a Tamura is made from it, then the Tamura also itself may not be brought as a shlamim. If you made a Tamura from an animal that was never rejected, even though it was designated and not brought, but it was not rejected, then a Tamura will be like its source, and it itself will be offered as a shlamim. Now, we learned very importantly, just to remember, that when do we consider animal Aleph rejected? So, Machlokes Rabbi and Abzeda, Rabbi says that animal Aleph is rejected only if you found it before you actually shechted animal number 2. And Abzeda says, no, that the animal Aleph is only going to be considered rejected if you found it before midday. If you found it after midday, even if both were available at the time of Shechita, it was not lechatchila included in the Korban Pesach. It's not called rejected. And then we also learned Rabbi that spoke about the following. If an animal Aleph was found before Shechita, so it means animal Aleph is rejected. What happens if you make the substitution after the Shechita? So Rabbi says that even though you made the substitution at a time, that the Tamura B'chlal, you can't say the Tamura was rejected because it was done after the Pesach was brought. From the outset, it can never be a Pesach. Truth be told, no Tamura can be a Pesach. But here on top of that, it was done at the time that was after the Pesach's bringing. Nevertheless, Rabbi said in the first version that since it came from an animal that was rejected, it can't be better than that animal. We're going to start today's daf really on daf Tzadik Vav Amud Beis. 6 lines before the bottom of the Amud, we're going to learn a second version of Rabbi. I know it says Rabbi, but the Bach is greatest Rabbi throughout. Fakert, the Rabbi holds that if the Tmura was made after the Pesach, even though it came from a rejected animal, that Tmura animal could be brought as a shlamim. Wow. And from there, we're going to go into a statement of Shmuel that really had 2 parts. Ultimately, we're going to see that the second part of the statement is not correct. He never made it. It's irrelevant. But initially, we're going to learn the following statement of Shmuel. Kol shabachatos mesa ba'pesav karav shlamim. Now, we're going to review when we learn the Gemara inside the halacha l'Moshe Misinai that there are 5 chatoos. A chatos is an animal that needs to be designated for a specific sin for which a person is obligated to bring a chatos. A person may not have a backup chatos. You can't say, I know that I'm going to sin, and I'm going to designate many animals already now, so when I do a sin, I'll already have an animal. It doesn't work that way. So what happens if there are going to be 5 scenarios where you have, so to say, a extra chatos that was already designated for a chatos, but it cannot be used anymore. So halacha l'Moshe Misinai that animal has to be left to die. Not sell it, wait until it gets blemished. And so by chatos, there are 5 chatois hamesos. We're going to go through all of the 5 when we learn the Gemara inside. And Shmuel says, number 1, that any time where you have a scenario that the chatos is left to die, that same scenario by a Pesach, the animal itself is going to be brought as a shlamim. And then initially we understand Shmuel to make another statement that whenever you have a scenario by a chatos, that the animal that you have now that cannot be used as a chatos is not left to die, but it's sent out to the pasture to become blemished. And then we'll see what you do with the money. You don't use the money for a chatos. You didn't sin. That money becomes communal money for Ketz HaMizbech, for carbon oil. In that scenario, a Pesach will also be left to the pasture. These are the 2 statements we have from Shmuel. We're going to hear a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. He disagrees with Shmuel. We're going to go into so many details about the 5 chatois hamesos. We're going to finally clarify what Shmuel really said. We will therefore have to, so to say, delete his second statement that he said, the chol shabachatos roya ba'pesach nami roya. Shmuel never said that. And the beauty of our sugya will be is that we're going to have really 2 versions, but they're going to at the end come together. And at the end, we're going to see that the machloikas of Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan is mamish the machloikas of Rabbi and Abzeda. So it's good to have in the mind the machloikas Rabbi and Abzeda that spoke about when is the cut-off time after which we say the animal was never rejected, whether it is the shechita or whether it is the zman of the shechita. And based on that, and other dinim that we're going to go by the 5 chatois hamesos, we're going to learn the shita of Rab Shimon regarding the chatos v'chulei v'chulei. It's going to become apparent. One of the nafkaminas between Rabbi and Rab Zera will be the machlekes of Shmuel and Rabbi Yechon. That will be mamish the whole daf. It's mamish beautiful. Let us start 6 lines from the bottom of the Amen on daf tzadik vav amid beis. This Gemara, you have to be mezok in Yiddish, you have to halt cut because we're putting together a beautiful puzzle. First of all, Ike the Masna Law Resha, that Rabbi, he made a statement on the first part of Rabbi Akiva's clarification of Rabbi Yeshua's statement, and that is quoting the Resha that HaPesach, if Shenim Tzakayim Shchitas HaPesach, Pesach Aleph was found before the Shchita, and guys, noch Rabbi L'Shitasai, Shchita is what we care about. Not about the Zman, but about the Shchita, which means the animal was available, which means that when you bypassed it, when you chose animal base, animal Aleph was Dachui, was rejected, and therefore Yira Ache Yistar V'yimkar V'yavi V'ram Shlamim. And on that we say, V'chein Timurasai, that a Tmura that comes from the animal that was Dachui also may not be brought itself as a shlamim. And on that, now listen to this version. Again, it says Rabba, we're going to go with Rabba, Amar Rabba, Loishanu. When do we say that the Tmura will be like its source? Only if you found it, Aleph, Rabbi Chen, before the Shechita, and you made the Tmura, we can even call that Gimel. It's another animal. You made the Tmura also before Shechita, which means that when Shechita came, there were 3 animals. So they were both rejected, even though Tmura may never be brought as a Pesach. Doesn't matter. It was there. But if the case that we had in the beginning of the end of yesterday of last year, even if you found animal Aleph before Shechita, animal Aleph will never be brought because you rejected it. But if the act of Tmura, which is a statement, calling it an act, if the Tmura was made after Shechita, amazing. The Aleph, the source of the Tmura, cannot be brought. Tmura say yes, Kreva Shlamim. And here are his words. My Tama, because Ki Kava Shchita, we're speaking about the fixing, the fixing of which one is the Pesach is the act of rejection. Ki Kava Shchita, what does the act of Shchita fix for the Pesach, and therefore everything has the other side, rejects the other one? Only something that Mida the Chazile, something that could have been brought for a Pesach. Mida the Chazile, something that was not fit. We're not speaking about not fit halachically. Guys, a Tmura is never halachically fit. We're speaking about fit, that you have it, it's here. If you didn't yet make the Tmura, it wasn't here. That's the pshat of Lechazile. So therefore, the fixing of Beis, which rejected Aleph, did not reject the Tmura. It's coming Mikoyach Duchuya. I don't care. The original one cannot be brought, but this one could be brought. 2 versions in Abba. And the Gemara, now before, in the last version, Abaya quoted the Braisa, and then the Gemara explained the Braisa. We're going to quote, in this version, Abaya, his student, quoted the same Braisa, but he didn't refute the Rabba from the Reisha, he refuted the Rabba from the Sefer, and Abaya succeeds. He refutes this din of Rabba. So guys, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amud. Amar Abaya, it says in the Braisa, we had this before, we had this above, it says in the Braisa the words Im Kesef. We explained the Rashi, that this whole word is extra. Im Kesef Matamud Leimet, and the answer is to be Marbe that Tmuras HaPesach. Achar Pesach, that it itself is brought as a shlamim. Now, fakert, other Rabba. Now this fits Rabba. But now we're with Tzadik Zayin. Now Abaya had to refute Rabba, has to quote the continuation of the Braisa. Yochel af lifnei Pesach came. You would think that a Tamura of Pesach that was found before the Pesach, that was found before. The Tamura of the Pesach that was found before, the Tamura of animal Aleph that was found before should also be brought. Talmud Leimer, who karev? The ein Tmuras HaPesach kreva. Fakir the Braisa is going to speak about a scenario where the Tmura cannot be brought. Now, what scenario are we including that's a novelty? Hechidami. You found animal Aleph before Shechita, and you did the act of Tmura, you declared Tmura before Shechita. And that the Braisa has to tell you that the Tmura is not brought. We don't need a Braisa for that Pshita. Lama likra. During the Shchita, you had 3 animals in front of you. You had animal Aleph, you had animal Beis, and you had the Tmura. Choosing one rejects everything else. Of course, you can't bring it. It must be Elalav that even though you found animal Aleph before Shchita, the novelty is that you did the Tmura that you should not have done, but you did it after Shchita. And on that, the Braisa is telling you that Eina Kireva Hirachi Yistoev. Clearly, the Braisa is referring about this case. And if Rabbi said what we have in the second version, what we began today, then indeed, Tiyufta the Rabbi Tiyufta. Okay, so it's good. So now we have this concept which is easier. It's easier to understand the first version. Anything that comes Mikoyach Dechuya cannot be greater than from where it came from. Yafa Koyach Haben Mikoyach Av is not said over here. Okay. Now let's go by heart.
We're left off that Rabbi holds that.
No, Rabbi was refuted. Rabbi was refuted.
Right,
What
so
Rabbi holds
his old opinion.
Well, either Rabbi was not refuted or Rabbi was refuted. We left off that the halacha is that something that comes mikoyach, a carbon that was the chuya, will also be the chuya. We don't know what Rabbi said, but if Rabbi made a statement that goes against what we just said, then Rabbi was refuted. Okay. Now, Chevra, the timna hoisa pelegish. That's the mnemonic to remember. Normally, the rule is that if you have an animal that has kedushas haguf and it cannot be brought, the rule is you sell it when it gets a blemish. So yira ache yistov or tira ache yistov, and then you use the money for something. Either you use it to buy the same animal type. There are times, and these are details that we don't have to know for this figure. Sometimes, no, the money is not used to buy the same animal type, but the money is going to be used for whenever the mizbeach is idle. If there's no carbon, not tzibur, not yachid, so then you use that money, you buy a carbon oil, and it's for the community. We call that kates hamizbeach, dessert for the altar. Not negea right now over here. Now, God told Moshe Rabbeinu, and you don't even have a hint of this in the Torah, this vitim nahoise pelegish, that's our own mnemonic, that there are 5 cases in where if you have a extra chatos, that chatos not only may it not be brought, but you don't have it blemished and then you use the money for whatever. No, you have to put the animal into a kippah. A kippah means into a room that had a dome on top, and you didn't, and the animal died in there. You let the animal die. You left the animal to die. Okay, Allah doesn't. What are the 5 cases? Let me go over the 5 cases. The vav of the vitimna is velat chatos. Chatos, unlike a Pesach that the Torah writes explicitly has to be male, right? A chatos, female. Now, we're going to learn there are certain chatos that are males, but they are exceptions. Normally, a chatos must be female. Oh, what happens, guys, if someone ate chelav b'shoigig, that was common, and they know that they sinned, and they designate a chatas, happens to be that the animal that they designated was pregnant, or it got pregnant. What I said now is very important. Whether it was pregnant before, I don't remember. At some point, it had a baby before you brought the mother. Now, the vlad of the chatas has the status of a chatas, but what are you going to do with it? You can't bring it. I only bring one chatas for that one sin. So I have an animal. The owner is already has kapara. That's vlad chatos, that God says that animal has to be put into the kippah. The taf of vitimna stands for temuras chatos, if you make a substitution of a chatos. So we don't say, wait until it gets blemished and then use its money for oila, or keep its money until for when you sin. That animal is going to be left to die. The third case is going to be when you have a chatos, Temuras chatos shemesu ba'alel. Members for if the owner designated the chatos, the owner passed away, Misa brings about atonement. If a person designates an oil and the person passes away, the heirs bring an oil. They bring that animal for its designation. If a person designates a shlamim and they pass away, they bring the shlamim. A chatos cannot be brought because who sinned? The father. The father is already atoned for. The nun is for what? Is for a Pesach. Which means that I designated the chatos and I lost my animal. This is the case of the Mishnah. And you know what? I can't find my animal. I designated animal number 2, chatos beis. And I brought chatos beis. And now I find chatos aleph. What do I do with it? I'm already atoned for. Has to be put into the kippah, left to die. And the ayin is I designate a chatos. A chatos also has an age. And I didn't bring it until the animal went beyond the age of which you had to bring it in. Chatos also has to be brought, my friends, in its first year. So what do you do with that animal? That animal is left to die. Now, something very important. It's important to me. There are many details on all these five. We will actually, just giving you a heads up, we will quote the sheet of Reish Lakish that clarifies the Mishnah of 5 chatois hamesois, that really if the animal only was lost and found, or if it was only beyond its age, that does not justify for you killing it. It's not left to die. The final two you need both. You need to have two problems. You need to have that you lost it and there's another problem. Either you lost it and it's blemished, or that you lost it and it's beyond its year, or that it's avra shenasai and it's blemished. And that detail we'll learn in a moment. Now let's read the Gemara. Amar Shmuel. Kol shebechatos meisa. He gives you a klal. This first statement will stand until the end. Any scenario that if this would have happened to a chatos, you would leave the animal to die. The Havamina is that Shmuel is saying it on all of the cases that we mentioned parenthetically, even in the Havamina. It's not on all, because you can never have a Vlad Pesach. Because at least in the Gemara's gender's understanding, a male cannot give birth. So a male behema cannot have a child. But it's okay, so it's not shy, it's a technicality. But the Havamina of Shmuel was that he's saying it on all of the cases, Taka. Whenever the rule is chatas is left to die, but Pesach, Korei Shlamim, if that were to happen by a Pesach, it is brought as a Shlamim. That's the key. That's the link. Not it is left to be blemished and with its money you buy a Shlamim. This animal is brought as a Shlamim. Now we're going to have to clarify that. Now comes statement number 2 that ultimately we will see Shmuel never said it. Whenever you have a scenario by a chatos, that the animal itself does not have to be left to die. The animal, yes, is going to be, you leave it to graze. And then when it gets blemished by the chatas, you use the money for an oilah. Now, is there such a case? And when will there be such a case? No, chatas is, people say, no, chatas is always left to die. We're gonna review these dinim. We're going to see machlekes tanoim. We're going to ultimately learn that there's a sheet of the Tanach Rab Shimon that holds that there is never such a case. And Shmuel must ascribe to Rab Shimon, which is why he never said this. But now I was saying that any time you have a chatas, that if the chatas is left to graze, then the Pesach is left to graze. And now you can already see the whole link to our Mishnah, because the Mishnah gave these 2 cases, right? That was the whole Mishnah. When do you have a case where the Moisar Pesach, you lost the Pesach, that was the case, or the Tmura, when is the animal brought and when is it left to graze? So Shmuel seems to be saying a klal. If this case would happen by a chatos, if the chatas is left to die, then the animal is brought. The animal is brought. If the case would have happened by a chatos and the rule will be roya, then by Pesach nami roya. On that says Rabbi Yochanan. Now on what? We don't know yet. But Rabbi Yochanan is pushing back on something. If you don't know Shmuel, you don't know what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Let's get the words. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, ein ha-Pesach, Korei Shlamim. When will you bring the Pesach itself? Elo shenimsa achar shchita. Guys, remember the previous suga of last year. Only if you found it after shchita. If you find the animal before shchita, which would mean, we already know what he means, which means that before that animal is dachui, that animal was rejected because it was available before shchita. When the animal is rejected, you can't bring a rejected animal as a shlamim. Yirache yistov. End of quote. Before we clarify that, now, before we focus on exactly where the Rabbi Yochanan argued with Shmuel, the Havamina was that Shmuel said Kol Shebechatos, he meant all 5. Again, not all 5, never all 5. There's no Vlad Pesach. He meant wherever it's shaykh can be. Maskiv La Rabbi Yosef on the first statement of Shmuel there. When you have a chatos, that if it became overaged, if that's the right word, and the rule is, this animal is not left to die. When people hear the statement, they jump because they say, what are you talking about? We just said a Mishnah that there are 5 chatois that are left to die. The ayin is sha'avra shenasa. How can he say chatra sha'avra shenasa l'riya azla? Because when you learn a Mishnah, it's like learning Chumash without Rashi. You need to have the Gemara. The Gemara clarified, even though we keep the number 5, but like we mentioned when we just spoke out the intro, that really the Amar of Shimon ben Lakish, Chata she'avra shenasa, that in itself does not condemn it to be left to die. You know why? Because we don't view this as a intrinsic, here we go again, Baruch, an intrinsic problem with the animal. What happens if you have an animal that's within the first year, but it's in a cemetery? And a kohen cannot enter a cemetery, which means that you can't get to it, not because the animal is not valid, it's because there's something external holding you back. That's his expression. That chata she'avra she'nasa is viewed as if it's standing in a cemetery, which means it never got an intrinsic problem, and the din is v'roya. And Rashi reminds us that it's late. The Mishnah does say v'timna. The Mishnah is our mnemonic. The Mishnah says that chata she'avra she'nasa is left to die. So we clarify this. We're going to learn this later in Kachim in more detail. That if the animal, aside of it being overaged, also has another problem, either it's blemished or it was lost. It says not only is it above its age, but it was also lost. So now you found it after it's overaged. That is where we say it's left to die. Okay. But the Nakuda is that we're going to accept that Shimon ben Lakish, that holds again that a chatos that is avra shenasa, the din is that chatos will be left to graze. Now, what was the second thing that Shmuel said? That wherever a chatos is left to graze, what happens to the Pesach? Left to graze, right? Ve'ilu bePesach, it's not true. If the Pesach is overage, kehai gavna karev shlamim. We don't have to have it blemished. We don't have to have it blemished, as we learned in the Brisa. We had this in the last year. Kesev l'Rabbi says a Pesach la'Aliyah. And kishoimer im keve kesev l'Rabbi es a Pesach she'avra she'nasoi u'shlamim aboy machmas Pesach. And we gave the two cases when we learned last year that it itself becomes a shlamim l'chol mitzvah shlamim she'tu'unim smicha u'nesachim u'tunu v'chazei v'shoik. And then we're just finishing the Bryce, and then when the Torah speaks about the im eis karbanai, the reason why the Torah gave a different rule for the eis, because the eis is different than the lamb. In one din, that the tail of the goat is not offered on the altar. Bottom line is that a chatos that is only avra shenasa, we will hold that animal is left to graze. Shmuel seems to be saying that whenever the chatas is left to graze, that by the Pesach it's also left to graze. Nisht emes. That Pesach she'avra shenasa is brought for a shlamim. So therefore, the Gemara clarifies that the first statement of Shmuel wasn't kol, even though he says the word kol. He wasn't referring to all the cases. He was only referring to one of the 5 cases. And guys, that's going to make it juicy because the one of the 5 cases is our sugya. Our whole sugya that we began on Daf Tzadik Vav Amud Beis was the Pesach, right? Avremel that got lost, and we designated Pesach Beis. It's this case. It only goes ba'avudin. Okay, it's not referring to any other dichui. Now here it fits. If an animal gets lost, so now appreciate Shmuel is saying 2 things, at least in the Havamina, that when you have a animal that gets lost, a chatos that gets lost. If Shmuel said what he said, that means there must be a scenario where even a chatos who gets lost, it's left to grace. We're gonna have to figure out when we have that, when that scenario. In other words, a chatos gets lost, you designated chatos base, you got atonement through chatos base. Now you find chatos aleph, there's no case where it gets grace. In this case, that's the classical case of chatos shemesa. And now it fits because the chatos is left to die, even though it was never rejected. You only found chatos aleph after you got your atonement. So what? God says, leave it to die. This animal, by the Pesach, this will be brought as a shlamim. Akan, it's beautiful. Because since that's what we learned in the Mishnah. If you found Pesach aleph after the shechita, that was the whole chiddush, the beauty of the Mishnah. It's not called rejected. You never bypassed it. It is brought as a shlamim. Problem is, but how can you say that Shmuel was referring to that? Because Shmuel made 2 statements. So the avod mi mishkachas lo, where will you find, if Shmuel made 2 statements and he's only speaking about avudim, so there must be one case by avudim where the animal, the chatos, is left to die. Another case by chatos avudim where the animal was lost, that it's left to graze. And on that Shmuel is saying, if the chatos is left to graze, so is the Pesach. No, according to Shmuel, where will you have a scenario where you lose the chatos and you found it at a certain point where it's shaykh to leave it to graze? Just like when we learned the Mishnah, we spoke about different times of finding the Pesach. Now let's bring the same thing that we learned in the last year over here. Same thing. A person sinned, God forbid. They ate chelav b'shoigi. They designated chatos aleph. They lost chatos aleph. They designate chatos beis. When exactly do we say that the surviving chatos is left to die? Oh, so now really there's a machlokes tanoim over there. Harei avuda. What happens if it's avuda b'shas afrasha? We lost chatos aleph, which is why we separated chatos beis, right? But what happens if we find chatos aleph? We find chatos aleph before chatos beis was brought. When you brought it, it was not lost. It was only lost when you designated animal beis. That's a machlokes tanoim. It's like this. Dilerabanan, l're'iyah azla. Let's learn the case in the Mishnah. Ditnan, guys. All this is we're learning tomorrow now. Hifresh chatasai. Right, I designated my chatos aleph, and I lost it. So then I designated chatos beis, and before I brought beis v'nimtzas harishayna. Now what's the din over here? Both of them are available. Interestingly, here Rabbi holds achas vehem tikrav, and that will be your case of chatos shemesa. And the other one will have to be left to die, divrei Rabbi. The Chachamim argue with that. The Chachamim hold that, when God tells Moshe Rabbeinu that the chatos is left to die is only in chatos mesa ella, that you found chatos aleph after you brought beis, which means hakoidim sheneschapru ba'olim. The din is, it's amazing. Now, guys, no one is saying that you bring it. People are going to jump. You're kidding? It sounds like it's the opposite. Here it's rejected. I know it's rejected. I know no one holds that this animal is brought as a chatos. Never. There's only one chatos for one sin. But if you found it before you chose one of the two, before you chose chatos beis, the Chachamim hold chatos aleph is not left to die. Take it the way we do it in the Mishnah by the Pesach. What do? You let it graze. Right there, it's a female animal, so we write tira stuff. So now here we have a problem. If Shmuel will hold like the Chachamim, so the case, and he's only speaking about a chatos that's lost, and he's making this parallel. If by the chatos it's left to die, by the Pesach it's brought shlamim. If by the chatos it's left to graze, if this is the case, then the Pesach is left to graze. The ilu bePesach heicha the Ovid, but it's found after chatzos, before it's brought. Before it's brought. If the key is, now we have to go back to Rabbi and Abzeda. But before Shchita, what's going to be the din?
Rabbi.
So then we learned above, Karek Shlom, and we got a problem over here. Because then the second statement of Shmuel is not true. Right? If you're going like Rab Zera. Then the second statement is not true. Because how can Shmuel say that whenever you have a scenario by the chatos that's left to graze, then the Pesach will be left to graze? It's not true. Again, we're assuming that Shmuel subscribes to Rab Zera. Mamish Gavaldik. So the Gemara says, no, Shmuel will hold like Rab Zera, but Shmuel Kerebi Svirale. Shmuel holds that I don't care when you found chatos aleph. I don't care. Even if you found it before you brought chatos beis. The Amar Avuda Lemisa Azla asks the Gemara, V'hakol Avuda L'Rebbi Mesa, V'ha Pesach Heicha the Ovid Koidem Chatzois. Again, V'nim says Koidem Chatzois. Even Abzeda will be moida. Even Abzeda will be moida. Vaitera doesn't fit. Then Roya Bamba Kasha. And the Gemara has such a Gavaldika answer. You cannot call something lost if it's lost at a time that it Bechlal cannot be brought. The whole term of Avuda must be after Chatzois. Nama, Mamish goes with Rav Zera. So it says the Gemara, no. That Koidem Chatzois, you can't call it lost, like Rava says. Rava's speaking about something else. Rava's speaking about the Chatos. What happens if you lose the Chatos at night? Night is a time that no carbon can be brought. So Rava said over there, Aveda Slaila Laf Shmuel Aveda. So therefore, Shmuel holds like Rab Zera. We're going to stand with that. We're going to clarify later that Rabbi Yechanan is going to hold like Rabba. It's going to be beautiful. So therefore, Atkan, it fits the first statement that wherever you have wherever you have a chatos that's left to die, that by the Pesach will be offered as a shlamim. That works. You know what the problem is the second statement of Shmuel. When he says, but wherever by a chatos it's left to graze, so then by the Pesach it's left to graze. If we're going to say, and we're saying that Shmuel subscribes to Rebbe, Shmuel subscribes to Rebbe, so there's no case. Rebbe always says that a chatos is going to be left to die. I don't care when you found it. I don't care if you found it after chatos beis was brought. I don't care if you found it before chatos beis is brought. Ella roya leRebbe hechem mishkachas la daf tzadik zayin amud beis. And there is one case according to Rebbe where a chatos will not be left to die. And you know what that will be? Listen to this. What happens if when a person sinned, it's not that they designated chatos aleph, right? And then they lost it. From the outset, they designated two animals. You can never imbue two animals with real chatos kedusha because chatos can only be brought for a specific sin. If I'm mechoyv to bring one chatos, I cannot sanctify two animals. But you know what I could do? I can say like this, that I have a habit of losing my animals. I don't know how to guard animals. I don't want to have a headache later. I'm right now getting an insurance policy. I'm right away designating two animals, not that they're both chatos, but I'm saying one of the two will be a chatos. From the outset, hitrish te chatois, and it's called la'achrayis, just to make sure that I'm covered in case I lose one. There, even Rebbe will be moida that when you bring one, the other one v'shina u'sheniya tira, because you can't call this lost. It never got lost. It was never an animal that was going to go on the altar. It was never clear that this animal will go on the altar. Okay. So that is the case that we're saying that what? So let's go through the words. So now, so there is a case, even according to Rebbe, and Shmuel holds like Rebbe, like we just proved, that a chatos is left to graze. Now, what did Shmuel say? That whenever the chatos is left to graze, then by the Pesach, it's also left to graze. That part won't fit. 3 lines from the top for ha ilu bePesach ki hai gavna. In that case, it won't be left to graze. If a person lechatchila designates 2 psachim, not both, one or the two, it's not never rejected. You have to remember the rules are different. It's never rejected because it was never a real Pesach for it to be rejected, and it won't be left to graze. So Ella, we must say. Now, guys, the fact is that if a person designates 2 animals from the outside of Pesach, it's brought as a shlamim. What did Shmuel say? Let's go in the opposite direction. Which Pesach is brought by a shlamim? If it's parallel by the chatos is left to die, is this chatos left to die? It must be that, yes, for Shmuel's first statement to stand, Shmuel must hold that even in a case where from the outset you designated 2 animals, not both with Kedushas Chatos, but as Achrayas, even here, God told Moshe, one you bring, the other one is left to die. Now we have such a shita, which is Rab Shimon. It must be Shmuel, ki Rab Shimon Sidolei, that he holds that Chatos, Chamesh, Chatois, Meisais, Rashi goes through the Gemara there, means that whenever a Chatos, you brought one, you got an atonement, no matter in what case, in all cases, the other one is left to die. So now at least Shmuel, if he subscribes to Rebbe, which he does, if he subscribes to Rab Shimon, which he has to, now that we also clarified that when Shmuel said, Kol Shabachatos Mesa, he wasn't speaking about all the 5 cases or all the 4 cases. He was not speaking about that. He was only speaking about a chatos that was lost. So there's 2. You got 2 animals. You have 2 animals. In all cases, Shmuel holds the animal by the chatos. The remaining animal is going to be left to die. Now, it fits. All of those cases, by the Pesach, the animal is brought as a shlamim. The problem is, Shmuel's second statement is not true. If he holds like Rab Shimon, there isn't a chatos that's left to grace. For Horoya, that's the second statement. Le Rab Shimon, leis le klal, doesn't exist. According to the Tanach Rab Shimon, no matter if you lose the animal and you find it after you brought the chatos base, if you lost the animal and you find it before you bring chatos base, if from the outset you never designated 2 chatos, you just designated one as a backup, it's also going to be put to death. It doesn't exist. So the Gemara says, indeed, it must be that Shmuel nami chada ka'amar. Shmuel really only made one statement. Look how we are limiting such a broad sounding statement to such a narrow statement. Kol shebachatos mesa. We're speaking specifically about a case where you have two animals. We're not speaking about a case where you only have one animal, but the owner died, right? Or the animal is overaged. No, we're only speaking about a case where wherever you have two chatais, one is used. Then Shmuel holds the other one will always be left to die. In such a case, by Pesach Karav Shlamim. And by the way, this only fits very clear. Shmuel has to hold like Rab Zera. Guys, don't forget that. Shmuel has to hold like Rab Zera. And not like Rabbi. And now, Umay Komash Mulan. So now that you limited it so much, like who would ever argue with that statement? The Gemara says no. Rabbi Yochanan argues with that statement. You know why? Because Rabbi Yochanan, saying the words, Rabbi Yochanan subscribes to Rabbi. Rabbi considers the cut-off point, like we had in the last daf, not Chatzois or after Chatzois. Koydem Shchita or La'achar Shchita. Oh, let's read it inside. So Lafukim in the Rabbi Yochanan the Amar, Ein HaPesach, Karav Shlamim, only if you find it after Shchita of the replacement of animal B. If you find it before Shchita, then what do you do? No, then that was our Mishnah. Then you leave the animal to graze. In other words, Alma Shchita Kava. Rabbi Yochanan clearly has to hold like Rabbi. Shmuel's statement was really so limited that what he really wanted to say is that we don't paskin like Rabbi. We view Chatzois. Now, what the beauty is, before Chatzois, that was the end of Amud Aleph, then it's not even called lost. But in order to have a case of two animals, it must be that you found it after Chatzois, but you have two animals. You found it before Shchita, but he holds like Rab Zera. Rab Zera follows this man Shchita, and therefore that animal is not rejected. That's the Nakuda. And therefore, according to Rab Zera, that animal is Taka left the word as a Shlamim. So Shmuel, therefore, based on Rab Zera, based on Rebbe, based on Rab Shimon, says Gavaldik, that in a case where by the Chatos, one is left to die, which is in all of the cases where there's two animals, in such a case, by the Pesach, it's Karav Shlamim, because the animal was really never rejected because we followed Rab Zera. Now, we're going to learn another version. The ending of the second version will be the same. Ultimately, it's going to be that Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are really continuing the machloikas of Rabbi and Rab Zera, but there's one detail that is added. And the Gemara, it's almost like it writes v'chuli at the end. After it tells you the addition, then it begins repeating a few words we had before, and then we automatically know that this goes until the end of the sugya. So Lishna Achrina, let's go back. Shmuel holds that a chatos, wherever a chatos is left to graze, right? That was the second statement of Shmuel that we didn't yet delete. In that case, the Pesach is left to graze. What was the kasha that we had on Amud Aleph? According to the Chachamim, when a chatos is lost, right? But it was found before the replacement was slaughtered. Before the replacement was slaughtered, what do the Chachamim say? Not Rebbe, that animal is left to graze, which would mean, if Shmuel made the second statement, that Pesach in the same case is left to graze. It's not true. Lishnachrina, the ilu bePesach, heicha the avad. This is just repeating the kasha we have from the Chachamim and Rebbe. And it was found after Chatzois, but before Shchita. That according to the Chachamim, guys, by Chatos, Yira. If the same thing would be by Chatos, by Pesach, Yira, but in such a case, if it's found before Shchita, now we already know that Shmuel subscribes to Rab Zera, which is why this is a kasha. But according to Rab Zera, it's going to be brought as a shlamim because it was never, because the shchit, the zman is the cutoff point. It was found after Chatzois. So the Gemara therefore says, this we didn't have in the first version. We attempted not to say that Shmuel has to hold like Rebbe, and then ultimately like Rab Shimon, which ultimately leads us to do something that we don't like to do, which is to delete the second statement of Shmuel. He never really made it. The first answer will be that Shmuel holds like Rabbi, that he holds that the shchit itself is koiveya. And that now it makes sense because, guys, let's go back to what we learned yesterday. According to Rabbi, if you have two animals of Pesach available by the shchita, even though the Pesach Aleph you found after Chatzois, but it's before the shchita. When you choose Beis, you bypass Aleph, you're doicha Aleph, then you can never bring Aleph. Then it would fit. But you can't tell me that Shmuel holds like Rabbi, because now we won't understand Rabbi Yochanan's argument with him. That that ein ha-Pesach karaf shlamim. Elo shenimsa achar shchita. But if you find it before shchita, loy, clearly, Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabbi. Clearly, no one is debating that. Rabbi Yochanan holds that the shchita is koiveya. And he's making that statement against Shmuel that clearly indicates that Shmuel, which is what we said in the first version, and that's the maskana. Shmuel subscribes to Rab Zera. So now we're back to the kasha. How, according to the Chachamim, what Shmuel says doesn't fit. So step number one is that it must be, therefore, that Shmuel follows the Das Yachid. Shmuel follows Rebbe. And Rebbe holds that even then it goes Lemisa. Now it fits because now Shmuel makes his first statement in the case where Chatas is left to die, which is when it's found before Shchita, even though it's found before Shchita. By the Pesach, if it's found before Shchita, it's brought as a shlamim. Why? Because he holds like Rab Zera. Once Chatzois comes, then you didn't bypass it. You didn't have it by Chatzois. The only problem will be kol avodim l'Rebbi Meson. V'ilu b'Pesach heicha da'avid before Chatzois. But it's just because you hold like Rab Zera, but there is a cutoff point. If you found it before Chatzois, so now you did bypass it. Now you did reject it. Now it's roya. Now it doesn't fit. So here we give the answer we gave in the bottom of Amud Aleph. It must be also that losing an animal and finding it before Chatzois is not called a lost animal. To have a metzias of avod, it must be that you found it during a zman that potentially you can bring it. And now from here until the end, the Gemara doesn't have to repeat it, because then the next kasha is, as we had on top of Amud Aleph. And ultimately, we're going to have to conclude that Shmuel holds like Rab Shimon. If Shmuel holds like Rab Shimon, then he never made a second statement. Because in the case of you having two chata'os, no matter when, according to Rab Shimon, there will never be a case where an animal is left to graze. So Shmuel never says that if by the chatas it's left to graze, by the Pesach it's left to graze, nishdoah such a case. So it's beautiful. So bottom line will be, it all comes back to Rabbi and Rab Zera. The yesoidos are perfect. If an animal is considered fit, if we look at it that way, and you make a choice and you bypass an animal, that's called you rejected the animal. That klal is standing. That animal that was rejected cannot be brought. Furthermore, let's go back to the beginning of today's shiur. Even if Rabbi made a statement like the second version, he was refuted. And if you take the animal that was rejected and you use it as the source of a substitution, I don't care when you made the substitution. Even if you made the Tamura after the Shchita, the halacha will be, it's coming mikoyach dachui, just like the source animal cannot be offered as a shlamim, it must be left to graze, and then with its money you buy a shlamim, so will be the din of the Tamura. The Tamura may not be brought as a shlamim, the Tamura also will be included, and that all of that is just so Rabbi Yeshua heard in Cheder that sometimes Tamuras Pesach kreva, other times Tamuras Pesach eino kreva. Now we have it clear. Where did it come from? Came from a dachui, eino kreva. If it didn't come from a dachui, then yes kreva. I'm happy we have time. Again, we're mamash going in towards the end. We have like a daf and a half. That's it. We're going to learn many Mishnayos, many details. Let's begin here on the end of Daf Tzadik Zayin Amud Aleph. Let's at least chaparayim the Mishnah. Now, there are some principles that we're going to have to go over again. But let's start the Mishnah. Hamafrish nekeva lepischoi. The Torah writes explicitly, most karbanos, right, by a bird, we say that God never specifies male or female bird. Technically, we're very happy with that because it's very difficult to discern for people like us which one is male and female. I'm sure there are simanim, but that's the rule. Ein zachrus ba'oifis. By animals, it's punkt verkehrt. The Torah, now some animals can come either male or female, but like we said, a chatos generally must be female. With the kohen, there's exceptions to that. A Pesach has to be male. It can be a lamb, it can be a goat. Has to be a zachar. What happens if from the outset you designated an akeva to your Pesach? Or the Torah writes that it has to be ben shana. The person at the outset designated an animal that was already 2 years old. Another detail that's not negeh for here. Remember the pilgus, just to know that the first year ends when the animal is 12 months. Then you have the 13th month where the animal is nishtahev, nishtahen, koreach mikan v'koreach mikan. There are animals that have to be brought in the second year. The second year really begins from the 14th month. But anyways, the animal was beyond its first year. So says our Mishnah, Yira ache yistov, you have to let the animal graze until it gets blemished. And the yimachir, and the yipludamav, take out the words linadava. Big debate what the girsa is, but at least to be consistent with everything we learned in the earlier Mishnah, the girsa Rashi. Look inside Rashi, the second to last line, he doesn't write the words nadava, which thank God nadava means ketz hamizbeach. It means v'yipludamav lishlamim. Now, guys, we can appreciate the chiddush here. We did learn a concept that for something not to be allowed to be brought as a shlamim, it must be because there was a rejection that happened. One might have argued that if from the very inception, from the very outset, this animal was never fit to go on the altar, why not? Because a Pesach cannot be a female animal. Because a Pesach cannot be an animal beyond its first year. So maybe it's not shot that it was fit and it was rejected. You can argue it was never rejected. Rejection, the concept of rejection, means something was nira v'nitcha. It was never nira. That's the words of Chazal. Our Mishnah describes that even though, look inside the Rashi, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid, that the kovate hafrasha, you fixed it as a Pesach with your designation. So it was a Pesach, it is a Pesach that's rejected. Nevertheless, harehu, it is like an animal that was fixed as a Pesach. And yeah, from the outset it was nitcha. Why? Once an animal has the title of rejected, then it will never be brought as a shlamim, but you have to use its money, and to get money, you have to have it blemished. So that's din number 1 of the Mishnah. That dichui me'ikara is called a dichui. It's called, and not, from the beginning it's a shlamim. And a shlamim can be male and female. A shlamim can be 1 year or 2 years. But no, this is a Pesach that's nitcha. That's din number 1 of the Mishnah. Let's chap daf tzadichas. We just learned the Mishnah. Din number 2 of the Mishnah. Amazing din. Hamafresh pischoi v'meis. A person designates a Pesach, and he passes away. Now, we did learn before that we learned a machlokes. If you had a group, they definitely may withdraw from their pre-registration. We learned the machlokes chachamim and abshimin until the shchita, until the zrika, but they can withdraw. You know what you can't have? You can't have an animal that for one moment has no one registered on it. What happens if someone designated the Pesach and they passed away before the time of bringing it came about? Now, it can be one person that goes to the other machlokes. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, can you have a Pesach for one person? Let's say that there was a whole group, and Rahman al-Islam, they all passed away. Point is that there's a moment where all of the pre-registered people on the Pesach passed away. Now, we have in the Torah Dinei Yerusha. And just to give a quick intro, we have another few minutes. It's a very important intro. Normally, when you have a transference of things from one owner to a new owner, an act of a kinyan needs to happen to make that transference. Whether it's a sale, whether it's a gift, you have to have a kinyan. One of the few exceptions is Yerusha. When the prior generation passes on and whatever they own goes down as an inheritance with following all the Dinei Yerusha that we have in Bava Basra at the end, the children, the heirs don't make a kinyan. And when we learned that sugya, we explained they don't make a kinyan because normally we don't view inheritance as a transference at all. Or the things are not going from the father to the son. No. The things remain in the possession of the father. It is the heirs that become the father. The children stand in the shoes of their father. It's a very important concept. So there's really not a transference. Now let's bring this down to this halacha. If we were to view it that way when it comes to Korban Pesach, so if the father who designated an animal pass away, if his heirs would stand in his shoes, then there was never a moment that the Korban Pesach had no one registered on it. But we don't say this concept by the Korban Pesach. When the father passed away, at that moment, even if the children are obligated to bring a Pesach, and even if they are going to choose to register themselves on the animal that their father designated, how nice. So the father is not here, at least we're fulfilling his mitzvah, we're connected to father. But until they explicitly registered on the animal, and guys, we already quoted the Machlekes Rishonim, how do you make registration? It's mashma from Rashi. By the way, you have to make a kinyan for that. Or if not, doesn't matter. However you make registration, until the children register on the animal, there was a moment that you had no one manui on the animal. Now, of course, every animal has no one registered on it. But when you do buy a carbon and you designate it for a Pesach, there has to be someone registered on it from when you designate it as a Pesach until when it's brought. And that's the top line. So Hamafrish Pischa Yumeis says the Mishnah, you cannot, this automatically cannot be brought as a Pesach. It doesn't go scot-free. Yes, you bring it as a shlamim. Look inside the Rashi. Why? Because to have a Pesach shemesu ba'alav. And therefore, what's the problem? Ve'ein kan menuyin. Even though the son wants to be registered on it, it's not good anymore. There was a moment where there was no one registered on it. And a lot more of this, God willing, in the next year. It's a beautiful din. To be continued. Guys, the truth is that from now it's really easy street. It's mamish. The hard daf was tzaddik zayin, was geschmack. Now we have one more daf of kachin, and the tzaddik tes Amid Beis already begins Arbi Pesach, and we should make a campaign to get the guys to learn it. It's almost 30 days before Pesach. Some dafim are very short, and even though that they're not that short, you can spend a lot of time learning the Rishonim, but we need 3 dafim credit for Pesach. Just saying, in the last dafim, Pesachim is very short. So that will for sure double up, that and the Shkolim. And sometime this week, we'll try to add in 2 extra daf without adding any extra time almost. It's going to be very easy.